Welcome to the Quantanix YouTube channel. This is the Next Layer podcast, episode 15. Hello and welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are wrestling with a question that, well, it's not just for philosophy classes or sci-fi novels anymore, is it? It's really pressing, it's practical, and it's getting more urgent all the time. AI ethics. And specifically, we're tackling the big one: can machines actually make moral choices?
It's a huge question.
It really is. I mean, think about it. AI systems are becoming so much more integrated into, well, pretty critical parts of our lives. You've got self-driving cars, algorithms making loan decisions, even systems helping out with medical diagnoses. Their autonomy is just growing.
Right. And with that autonomy comes these situations, these moments where they face choices that have real ethical weight.
Exactly. So this isn't just, theorizing anymore. It's become this urgent need to figure out if machines can navigate right and wrong, and if so, how.
It's a practical problem now.
It really is. So our deep dive today is built around a pretty comprehensive set of sources. We've got articles, research papers, expert commentary, all digging into this idea of machine morality and ethical decision-making in AI.
Yeah, it gives us a great foundation to work from.
Absolutely. This material gives us a fantastic framework, sort of pulls back the curtain on the foundational ideas, the actual real-world attempts to put ethical guidelines into practice, and the really complex debates that are happening right now.
And there are definitely debates.
Oh, for sure. So over the next little while, we're going to try and unpack this incredibly rich and sometimes pretty challenging landscape. Our mission really is to take you beyond just the headlines and get into the core concepts. Explore what it even means for a machine to be moral. By the end, hopefully you'll have a much clearer picture, maybe some new questions too about that central idea. Can machines really make moral choices? Let's jump in. Okay, so let's unpack this first bit. When we talk about machines making moral choices, what are we actually defining? What does artificial moral agents actually mean?
Yeah, that's really the essential place to start, isn't it? We're basically talking about a specialized area within, the broader field of AI. So while your traditional AI might focus on things like perception or learning or problem solving, this subdiscipline, people call it artificial morality or machine ethics, it's specifically focused on trying to equip artificial systems with, well, moral capacities.
So it's not just about getting the job done, but getting it done ethically. Is that the idea?
That's exactly it. The sort of fundamental goal here is to develop agents, and these could be robots or software or other kinds of automated systems. Agents that are capable of first recognizing situations that have moral significance, then evaluating the different possible actions from an ethical point of view, making a decision based on that ethical evaluation, and then crucially acting on it.
Wow.
And like you said, this isn't just sci-fi in labs anymore. These agents are increasingly operating out there in the real world where their actions have real, tangible consequences for people and the environment too.
Right. So when we start thinking about building these systems, these moral decision makers, where does the thinking even begin? What are the sort of foundational theoretical questions the sources bring up?
Well, the sources really highlight that the theoretical thinking here kind of operates along two main dimensions. They're distinct, but they're also really deeply intertwined. You've got the meta-ethical questions, and then you've got the normative dimensions.
Okay, meta-ethical. That sounds like digging down to the absolute basics, like what morality even is.
Exactly. Meta-ethics asks those really fundamental kind of abstract questions about the nature of moral agency itself. It's not asking what is right or wrong in a specific case, but more like what makes a being capable of acting rightly or wrongly in the first place. So when you apply that to AI, the questions become, what is moral agency really? Is it something artificial systems can genuinely possess? Or are they just like simulating moral behavior based on code? And if they can possess it, what would an artificial moral agent need to have? Would it need something like consciousness or free will or sentience? Things we often link to human morality.
Deep questions.
Yeah, very deep. And this meta-ethical digging leads to a really critical look at the differences between human and artificial moral agency. Can the really complex cognitive stuff, the emotional foundations of human morality like empathy, our feeling of suffering, social learning, intuition, can those things actually be replicated or even properly approximated in machines? Or is there just a fundamental gap that means machines can never be moral agents like humans are? It forces us to define our terms. And it really raises a core question for you, the listener, to think about. What do you believe is the essential thing that makes a being capable of moral choice? Is it cognition, consciousness, emotion, something else entirely?
Yeah, you could debate that one forever. Okay, so if metaethics is about the nature of moral agency, then the normative dimension, that's more about the rules or standards we'd use if we did build moral AI.
Exactly right. The normative dimension, especially in what they call the narrower focus of machine ethics, shifts to the prescriptive questions. If we are going to build these things, which ethical standards, which principles, which frameworks should we actually implement inside them? How should they figure out the right thing to do?
And that's where those classic philosophy theories come in, right? Like utilitarianism and all that.
Absolutely. The source material points to the big Western ethical traditions
Hmm.
as, potential starting points, but it also highlights how tricky it is to just apply them directly. Should an AI be programmed using utilitarian ideas where the goal is always to maximize overall happiness or well-being for the most people?
Hmm.
Usually by weighing consequences.
Right. The greatest good for the greatest number.
Or should they follow deontological approaches? Those prioritize sticking to duties, moral rules, or rights, kind of regardless of the outcome. You know the classic trolley problem example people always bring up, even though it's way too simple for real AI?
Yeah, yeah. Sacrifice one to save five.
Right. A utilitarian AI might be designed to calculate those outcomes and pick the action that minimizes overall harm, even if it means actively sacrificing one person. But a deontological AI, if it was programmed with a strict rule like never actively cause harm, might just freeze up or choose totally differently. The challenge is encoding these really complex, often conflicting human ideas into algorithms.
Mm.
And the sources also bring up a really intriguing normative question: how virtue ethics might apply to AI.
Virtue ethics. That's about character traits, right? Like being honest or courageous.
Exactly. Unlike utilitarianism or deontology, which focus on actions or rules, virtue ethics is all about developing good character traits or moral dispositions: honesty, courage, compassion, fairness, things like that. So the question becomes, can machines embody character traits? It feels a bit weird, doesn't it, thinking of a machine having courage or compassion?
Yeah, definitely.
But the sources suggest it's part of the debate. Maybe an AI could be designed to simulate or at least act in ways consistent with these virtues, even if it doesn't feel them like we do. Could you build an AI that consistently acts fairly, not just because it's following Rule X, but because it's somehow designed with a disposition towards fairness?
Wow. Trying to program character, that really does show how this pushes the boundaries of our usual ethical thinking. And it sounds like you can't just pick one human theory and sort of plug it into the machine, can you?
Exactly. The sources point to a big ongoing debate about whether our existing human moral theories, which, developed within human societies, human biology, human psychology, are even adequate or fully applicable for artificial agents that operate so differently. Maybe we need entirely new ethical approaches designed specifically for machine morality that really take their unique abilities and limitations into account.
Okay, so moving beyond the sort of philosophical nuts and bolts of how a machine might theoretically make a moral choice, there's the much bigger context. So what does all this actually mean for us, for society, for the future?
Oh, that leads us right into the broader normative scope of machine ethics. This isn't just about the AI's internal code. It's about its impact when it's actually deployed out there in the world. It forces us to really critically evaluate the implications. Like, is pursuing artificial morality actually a good thing for society overall? Are there domains, specific areas, or types of decisions where artificial moral agents should just be completely restricted or maybe even banned? And maybe the most critical question: which moral decisions, if any, should only humans ever be allowed to make, no matter how smart the AI gets?
That's a huge question for you, the listener, to really think about, even just personally. Picture those really high-stakes scenarios, like decisions made by a robot on a battlefield, or an autonomous medical system making life or death calls, or maybe even an AI judge in court. Which of those would you be comfortable potentially handing over to an AI system, even one designed with the best ethical code imaginable?
Exactly. And these thoughts go beyond just single decisions to really complex societal issues, like what's the potential moral status, maybe even the legal status, for these agents as they get more sophisticated? Should they get some kind of status, maybe like corporations have legal personhood? Or should responsibility always, fundamentally, trace back to the human actors involved in creating and deploying them? And what are the potential transformative effects? If these artificial moral agents become widespread, how might that change human moral reasoning itself? Could it actually shift how we understand right and wrong? Could it change our social structures, our relationships?
Wow, yeah, that's That's a lot to think about. And the reality is, like you said earlier, this isn't just theory anymore, is it? The speed of AI development has really pushed this from philosophy seminars into, well, immediate practical necessity, which has led to this explosion of activity in developing ethical frameworks.
That is absolutely right. The sources really emphasize that this urgency is why we're seeing so many guidelines, principles, frameworks popping up from governments, international bodies, industry groups all over the world. And interestingly, there's actually quite a bit of convergence. Many of these different frameworks seem to be circling around a core set of key principles, even if the specifics and how to implement them are still being worked out.
And it sounds like these frameworks aren't just being dreamed up by the tech folks themselves.
No, not at all. The sources strongly argue for a multi-stakeholder approach.
Yeah.
Developing and governing ethical AI needs ongoing conversation and collaboration, not just among the technologists and engineers, but crucially involving ethicists who get the philosophical side, policymakers dealing with regulation, legal experts, and really importantly, the affected communities, the actual people whose lives these systems will impact.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the frameworks themselves, they're understood to be iterative. They have to keep evolving because the AI tech itself is constantly changing, bringing new capabilities, new challenges that need updates in how we think about governing them ethically.
But even with all these frameworks being developed, the sources seem to suggest that actually putting them into practice, that's where it gets really tough.
It's incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
Research and reports mentioned in the sources point to these significant, persistent gaps between the high-level aspirational principles in the guidelines, AI should be fair, AI should be transparent, and actually implementing them in the day-to-day reality of AI research, development, and deployment.
Right. Easy to say, hard to do.
Exactly. It's one thing to state a principle like fairness. It's completely another thing to translate that into concrete design choices, coding practices, testing procedures, operational safeguards that ensure fairness in practice across millions of users in unpredictable real-world situations.
So this implementation challenge really highlights the critical need for more robust mechanisms. We need better ways to turn these abstract principles into concrete practices. We need technical standards engineers can actually follow, regulatory requirements that ensure compliance, and crucially, accountability measures that make it clear who is responsible when things inevitably go wrong. So while the frameworks are evolving, a lot more work is needed in these operational areas, especially for really complex stuff like fully autonomous systems, tackling bias in huge machine learning models, and understanding the broad societal effects of automation driven by AI.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Let's look at one big attempt to make these high-level ideas concrete, the European Commission's framework for trustworthy AI. The sources use this as a key example of how people are trying to operationalize AI ethics, right? Through specific criteria. It lays out 7 key requirements.
Yes, exactly. The EC framework is widely cited. It's seen as a foundational example of how governing bodies are trying to turn ethical principles into specific, actionable criteria that AI systems should try to meet if we want them to be trustworthy and, actually good for society. It provides a pretty detailed roadmap, even if, as we said, actually implementing that roadmap is still very much an ongoing process.
Okay, so let's dive into those requirements, as laid out in the sources. Number 1 is human agency and oversight. What's that about?
So the core idea here is that AI systems should fundamentally serve humans, empower humans. They shouldn't undermine our judgment or our autonomy. They need to be designed in a way that lets humans make informed decisions and fosters respect for our fundamental rights. It's really about ensuring the AI stays a tool under human direction, rather than taking control in ways that diminish our capabilities or freedom.
Okay, and the sources give specific examples of how you might actually build that into a system, like technically.
They do. It often shows up in different design patterns. You might have human-in-the-loop systems. There, the AI is more like an assistant suggesting things, doing analysis. But a human user keeps direct control and makes the final critical decision, especially when the stakes are high.
Right.
Then there's human on the loop. In that case, the AI operates more autonomously, but humans are monitoring its performance, watching its outputs, ready to step in if something goes wrong or it starts behaving unexpectedly.
Okay, monitoring.
And finally, you have human-in-command structures. That's where humans keep the ultimate authority to start the system, stop it, change its settings, or override its overall operation. The key takeaway is really that for AI to be trustworthy, a human needs to be involved at some meaningful level, especially when there are potential moral consequences.
That feels incredibly important. It directly tackles that fear lots of people have about losing control, doesn't it? And it makes you really think about that question for you, the listener. How much control in a situation with moral implications would you personally feel comfortable handing over entirely to an AI?
It's a question that's only going to get more pressing. Okay, the second principle they highlight is technical robustness and safety.
So this is basically making sure the AI doesn't just like crash or mess up unexpectedly.
That's definitely part of it, but it's broader than just avoiding crashes. It requires that AI systems are designed to be resilient against errors, failures, even malicious attacks. They have to be secure and reliable. They need to perform consistently and predictably, not just under perfect lab conditions, but across a whole range of diverse operating environments and unexpected situations.
Right, real world stuff.
Exactly. This means putting in rigorous validation and verification processes, building in fail-safe mechanisms, having fallback procedures ready if the system runs into something it wasn't explicitly trained for. The sources really stress that accuracy, reliability, reproducibility, these are absolutely critical, especially in high-stakes areas like healthcare.
Yeah, you don't want a misdiagnosis.
Exactly. Or transportation, like autonomous cars dealing with sudden obstacles. Or financial services, where algorithmic trading glitches can cause huge economic damage. And this requirement, it extends beyond just the system's code. It includes how it integrates with other systems, ensuring they work together, and designing for long-term maintainability, making sure you can update it safely over its whole lifespan. Safety isn't just a feature you add, it's fundamental, ongoing.
Absolutely. Yeah, if an AI is making decisions affecting safety or well-being, it just has to be rock solid. Okay, what about the third one? Privacy and data governance.
Ah, yes. This one's fundamental because AI systems, especially the machine learning ones, are incredibly data hungry.
Yeah.
You basically can't have ethical AI without ethical management of the data that fuels it. It's completely linked.
So it's more than just following privacy laws like GDPR.
Oh, much more. It requires really comprehensive data governance mechanisms. Things that ensure data quality, making sure the training data is accurate, relevant, representative, things that ensure data integrity, protecting it from being changed or corrupted, and ensuring legitimate access, only letting people see or use the data when necessary and with proper permission. So the governance framework needs clear, well-defined protocols covering the whole data lifecycle, how it's collected, processed, stored securely, shared, if at all. And a real cornerstone of this principle is making sure that data subjects the individuals whose data it is keep appropriate control over their personal info, right? It's like accessing it, correcting it, deleting it. The sources are really clear on this. You just cannot have trustworthy AI without ethical data management built into the core design and operation from the start.
Right, because bad data can lead to bad outcomes, amplify biases. Which actually brings us to another principle, but let's stick with the EC ones for a sec. What's the fourth key requirement?
Transparency. And this is actually kind of a multifaceted concept in the framework. It covers data transparency, understanding what data was used, where it came from. It covers system transparency, having some level of visibility into how the AI actually works and makes its decisions. And it could even extend to business model transparency, understanding the purpose, the context for why the AI is being used, and who stands to benefit.
And this is where that idea of explainable AI or XAI comes in, right? Trying to get the why behind an AI's decision.
Precisely. A key mechanism for achieving transparency is traceability. That means having the ability to understand the step-by-step process an AI use to get to a specific decision or output. It allows stakeholders to trace those outputs back to the input data and the algorithmic logic that produced them. And explainable AI, XAI, is the whole field focused on developing methods to communicate that decision-making process in ways that are actually meaningful and accessible to different people.
Because it's hard, right? These things can be like black boxes.
Notoriously difficult. Yeah.
Yeah.
Many powerful AI models, especially deep neural networks, function as these incredibly complex black boxes where sometimes even the developers can struggle to give you a clear, human understandable reason for specific output. So the challenge is tailoring those explanations. A technical expert might need to see the detailed model parameters, while a user or a regulator just needs a clear, non-technical summary of why the decision was made.
Okay, so we have these underlying theories, these attempts like the EC framework to create ethical guidelines. But let's get real, actually building machines that can navigate the messy, ambiguous, often contradictory world of human ethics. That must present some huge challenges, technically and philosophically. Let's dig into some of those hurdles the sources highlight.
Oh, absolutely. That gap between principle and practice is massive because the challenges are just profound. One of the most fundamental is simply the difficulty of computationally representing moral concepts.
You mean, how do you translate abstract stuff like justice or fairness or compassion into math and code that a machine can actually process?
It's exactly that. It's about capturing the incredibly nuanced, context-dependent, often subjective nature of ethical reasoning. The sources really emphasize how different this is from typical computer tasks. It's not like solving a math problem or following a clear logical rule. Human moral reasoning involves weighing competing values that might conflict, thinking about potential long-term consequences that are often super uncertain, dealing with ambiguity, exceptions, cultural differences.
Right.
Think about just the concept of truthfulness. It's not a simple yes-no, is it? There are white lies, maybe justified deception in some cases, selective omission. How do you possibly encode the context and intent needed to tell the difference?
Yeah, tricky.
Doing this requires really significant advances in things like knowledge representation, how you structure information about the world, and values so the AI can use it. Also, reasoning under uncertainty, and crucially, value alignment, making sure the values the AI operates on genuinely line up with complex, diverse, sometimes conflicting human values. A second challenge, and maybe the one that gets the most attention, is ensuring diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness.
The AI bias issue. We hear about this constantly.
And for very good reason, because it's a really pervasive and serious problem. Unfair bias can sneak into AI systems from all sorts of places. The most common culprit is biased training data, which often just reflects historical and societal prejudice.
So the data itself is prejudiced.
Often, yes. If the data you use to train an AI reflects existing inequalities, say, in hiring patterns or loan approvals or criminal justice outcomes, the AI will learn those biases, and it won't just learn them. It can perpetuate them, even amplify them. But it's not just the data. Algorithmic design choices can accidentally introduce bias too, maybe by favoring certain kinds of data or optimizing for metrics that end up disadvantaging certain groups. And even the way an AI is deployed and interacts with different user groups can reveal or worsen bias.
Wow.
So the goal here isn't just avoiding obvious, overt bias. It's about actively trying to foster diversity and equity in the outcomes across different demographic groups. And that requires incredibly careful, critical work. Data collection and curation, auditing data for bias before you use it for training, rigorous algorithm design and testing that specifically looks for disparate impacts, and then ongoing monitoring of how the system performs once it's out in the wild across all the different populations it serves.
It sounds incredibly complex.
It is. And it's also philosophically and technically complex, because achieving fairness often means dealing with trade-offs between different types of fairness. For example, should an AI predicting loan risk aim for equality of opportunity, giving everyone an equal shot based on neutral criteria? Or equality of outcome, aiming for similar approval rates across different groups, even if that means adjusting the criteria?
Right, those aren't always the same thing.
They're also not compatible.
Yeah.
And it forces really difficult societal conversations about what kind of fairness we actually want to prioritize. Which leads to a question for you, the listener. How would you define fairness for an AI system making decisions that affect different people? What does fair mean in that context?
That's a brilliant example of how these technical problems force us to confront our own values and what we want society to look like. What's another major hurdle mentioned?
Another challenge is enabling what's called case-based moral reasoning. Humans often learn and refine our moral compass by looking at specific examples, right? We see how ethical principles play out in particular, often complex situations, and then we kind of extrapolate that understanding to new cases. AI systems trying to make moral decisions need a similar ability to learn from moral examples or data sets of past decisions, and then apply those learned principles and nuances to new situations they've never seen before.
But the real world is just full of unique situations, isn't it? Stuff that doesn't fit neatly into the training data.
Exactly. And human moral judgments in these novel situations often hinge on incredibly subtle contextual factors, things like nonverbal cues, social dynamics, specific historical or personal context. These are factors that are extraordinarily difficult to capture fully in training data or to encode explicitly in rules. And AI might learn the rules, but applying them appropriately requires a really deep understanding of the context. So this challenge requires big advances in areas like analogical reasoning, the AI's ability to see parallels between situations that look different on the surface. Also, causal understanding, grasping cause and effect in complex social or physical settings, and robust contextual adaptation. And then there's the really challenging temporal dimension of moral decision-making.
You mean the fact that actions have consequences that stretch out over time,
Yeah.
sometimes way down the line?
Precisely. Moral choices often involve thinking about the impact of an action not just right now, but far into the future. And those long-term consequences are frequently really hard, maybe impossible to predict accurately. And how we value them might change over time, too. So an AI system needs to somehow factor in this temporal aspect, balancing the immediate moral issues with these potentially far-reaching, uncertain future implications.
Okay.
And this temporal challenge is especially sharp in areas like environmental sustainability. That principle of societal and environmental well-being requires thinking about the long-term impact of resource use or pollution on future generations, on ecosystems, including non-human life. Decisions made today by an AI managing, say, a power grid or resource allocation could have major ripple effects decades from now.
Thinking about those long-term consequences really brings up a thorny issue. If an AI system does make a decision that has negative consequences, especially one with a moral angle, who is actually responsible? This feels like one of the trickiest areas the sources get into.
It is, and it's definitely one of the most contentious principles within AI ethics, accountability. It's just incredibly challenging to clearly assign responsibility in systems that operate with different levels of autonomy, especially when they cause harm or make problematic calls.
Because it's usually not just one programmer making one mistake that leads to a bad outcome, right?
It's exactly. Responsibility is often inherently spread out, distributed across lots of different actors involved throughout the system's life. You've got the researchers who developed the basic algorithms, the engineers who designed and built the specific system, the people who gathered and labeled the training data, which, as we said, can bake in bias, those who decided to deploy the system in a particular way, and the operators or users who interact with it day to day. It's a whole complex chain.
Yeah.
And it gets even more complicated because advanced AI, especially complex machine learning systems, can sometimes show emergent behaviors, actions, or outcomes that weren't explicitly programmed or even fully anticipated by the developers. So if the system does something unexpected and harmful, figuring out who's truly culpable is extremely difficult.
The sources mention auditability as a key mechanism to try and navigate this complexity. How does that help?
Yes. The idea is that to even enable accountability, AI systems need to be designed and documented in ways that make them understandable and open to external evaluation. And this isn't just about technical auditing, like checking the code for bugs. It includes ethical auditing that involves systematically evaluating the system's performance, its impact on different groups, assessing fairness and bias in its decisions, and checking if it's complying with ethical principles and regulations.
So it's a broader kind of checkup.
Much broader. And developing effective ways to do this ethical auditing requires deep collaboration. You need the technical experts, sure, but also ethicists who can spot the moral hazards, domain specialists who understand the context where it's being used, legal experts, and critically representatives from the communities actually affected who can speak to the real-world impact. Everyone needs to be able, in some sense, to look under the hood and understand how and why the system is doing what it's doing.
And this links back to those really difficult questions about legal and moral status that you mentioned earlier.
It does, yeah.
As AI gets more capable, does that whole debate about whether they should have some kind of legal rights or responsibilities just intensify?
It absolutely does. As these systems become more autonomous, more capable, these questions keep bubbling up. Should they get some form of legal personhood, maybe like corporations have? Or should responsibility always and ultimately trace back to human actors, the developers, the owners, the operators? There's no consensus on this, and different legal systems are trying to figure it out in different ways.
Right.
And these aren't just abstract academic debates either. They have very real practical implications for things like legal liability, who pays if an autonomous car causes an accident, for insurance frameworks, for how compensation works when AI systems cause harm or make morally wrong decisions. And this is all compounded by those temporal issues we talked about. Systems can be out there for years, and during that time, their operating environment changes, the data they see changes, even society's expectations about their behavior can shift. So ensuring accountability over time means you need ongoing monitoring, evaluation, and really clear procedures for updating, retraining, or even taking systems offline if they're no longer meeting ethical standards or start behaving unpredictably.
Okay, this deep dive wouldn't really be complete without stepping back one more time and thinking about the even bigger picture, how this whole quest for AI ethics and developing artificial moral agents impacts society more broadly, and where this might all be headed.
Yeah, that brings us squarely to that principle of societal and environmental well-being. Current frameworks, like the EC guidelines, really reflect this growing global understanding that AI development can't just be judged on its technical prowess or economic return. It has to be evaluated based on its broader impacts on society and on the environment.
So the end goal is really for AI to be a net positive force for humanity, for the planet.
That's the idea. The principle explicitly requires that AI systems should ultimately benefit all human beings, promoting human flourishing, well-being, social good, and explicitly includes future generations. It also mandates minimizing negative environmental impacts and, interestingly, considering the impacts on non-human entities within ecosystems. Now, implementing that requires developing and using really comprehensive impact assessment methods that can look at both the direct and indirect effects of deploying AI across multiple dimensions: social, economic, environmental, ethical, and over different timescales.
And speaking of environmental impact, the sources specifically mention environmental considerations beyond just that broad principle, right?
Right. This includes acknowledging the significant computing resources and energy needed to train and run many advanced AI systems, particularly things like large language models, which are incredibly power-hungry.
Yeah, the carbon footprint issue.
Exactly. That raises serious questions about the environmental sustainability of how we're currently developing AI. But at the same time, the sources also acknowledge the other side of the coin. AI also holds enormous potential as a tool to help address environmental challenges, things like optimizing energy use, improving resource management, developing smarter electrical grids, enhancing climate modeling and prediction. It's a really complex dual relationship. Another absolutely crucial societal consideration is the democratization of AI.
You mean making sure the benefits and the access to AI aren't just stuck in the hands of a few powerful players?
Precisely. This raises really important questions about access, about equity, about the potential for AI to actually worsen existing digital divides if we're not careful. The principle suggests that AI systems should ideally be accessible to everyone, regardless of their background, socioeconomic status, location, or disability. And that requires focusing on inclusive design and making sure the benefits of AI are distributed equitably.
But that's not really the current situation, is it?
Well, the sources do point out the current reality where a lot of the most advanced AI capabilities and the resources needed to develop them are concentrated within a small number of very large tech companies. And that concentration has real implications for competition, potentially stifling innovation elsewhere and potentially worsening social inequality if access to powerful AI tools remains limited.
Okay, finally, let's touch on the evolution of human-AI interaction, especially thinking about these potentially moral AI agents. This feels like it gets right to the core of our future relationship with machines.
It really does. And it presents some profound implications for our own moral development, for the nature of our social relationships. As artificial moral agents get more sophisticated and potentially more integrated into our lives, maybe as personal assistants, companions, even advisors in really tricky areas, big questions come up about how they might influence our own human moral reasoning, how we develop our own moral intuitions.
Like, could we get lazy? Could we become less capable ourselves if we start leaning on AI to make moral calls for us?
That's definitely a concern. People raise this idea of moral de-skilling, a potential erosion of our own human moral agency if we become too reliant on AI for ethical guidance or decision-making. Will we lose the ability, or maybe the motivation, to really wrestle with moral dilemmas ourselves if there's always a machine ready to give us an answer? However, the sources also suggest a potentially more optimistic or at least intriguing possibility. Could well-designed AI systems actually serve as moral tutors or advisors? Maybe by presenting different ethical viewpoints or highlighting consequences we hadn't considered, could they actually help humans develop stronger, more nuanced moral reasoning skills? Could interacting with a thoughtfully designed AI potentially make us better at being moral?
Wow, that's a pretty significant future question right there. Could AI, instead of diminishing us, actually enhance our own ethical capacities?
It's a future worth thinking about very carefully.
Okay, so let's try and bring this deep dive to a close. What are the main takeaways from digging into this really complex landscape of AI ethics and machine moral choices based on the sources we've looked at?
Well, I think the core conclusion, really, from all the material, is that this question, can machines make moral choices?
Yeah.
It's not just a fascinating theoretical puzzle. It is a profound technical challenge. And it's a fundamental philosophical inquiry that forces us, really, to re-examine our most basic ideas about what moral agency even is, about consciousness, about decision-making itself.
Yeah, and it's definitely clear that developing artificial moral agents isn't just, speculative sci-fi anymore. It's an active, rapidly evolving area of development. It has practical implications that are hitting us right now, impacting our lives.
Absolutely. And the development of these comprehensive ethical frameworks, like the EC guidelines we talked about, that represents really significant and necessary progress. Trying to operationalize AI ethics, trying to translate abstract values into concrete requirements for trustworthy systems. But as we've discussed, the persistent, really difficult challenge is bridging that gap between those aspirational principles and actually implementing them effectively throughout the entire lifecycle development deployment operation. It's one thing to say you value fairness. It's a whole other thing to ensure it's truly baked into every line of code, every bit of training data, every user interaction.
Right. And it's definitely not a challenge that any one group, not just technologists, not just ethicists, can solve on their own. The sources really hammer home that the path forward absolutely requires ongoing, dedicated collaboration. You need the technologists building the systems, the ethicists understanding the moral terrain, the policymakers dealing with regulation, legal experts, and crucially, the affected communities who know the real-world impact.
Yeah, ultimately, the success of this whole endeavor, building ethical AI, potentially building artificial moral agents, it's going to depend not just on future technical breakthroughs in AI's moral reasoning abilities, but also, maybe more importantly, on our collective ability as a society to thoughtfully navigate the incredibly complex philosophical, social, and practical challenges that are going to keep emerging as this boundary between human and artificial moral agency continues to blur and evolve. It's a huge opportunity, to leverage powerful technology for human good, but it comes with this tremendous responsibility to make sure it stays aligned with our deepest values and really does promote the well-being of everyone.
And that brings us right back to that really intriguing possibility the sources raised near the end. The potential for AI to act as a kind of moral tutor or advisor. It forces a thought experiment, doesn't it? What would it really mean for our own human moral development, for our own capacity to reason ethically if we started relying on machines to help guide our moral compass? Is that a future we are consciously choosing to build? And are we ready for the consequences, good or bad? That's definitely something for you to ponder long after this deep dive is over. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. If you found this conversation thought-provoking, please like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more deep dives on the Next Layer podcast at the Quantanix YouTube channel.